Welcome to the Wild Physio podcast with your host, Andrew Wild. Today, I have Lachie Wilmot on, and he's a strength and conditioning coach with a Bachelor of Exercise and Sports Science, honours in rate of force development in team sport athletes, and is the co-owner of Athletes Authority, which is an amazing facility. Lachie worked at the GWS Giants as the head of strength and power for over 7 years and has also worked with the Parramatta Eels. Huge welcome to Lachie Wilmot. How are you, mate?
Good. Yourself? Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, mate. Really looking forward to it. Now, as I was saying off air, I'm going to throw you under the bus with a few Oprah-style questions. Yes, no, or maybe. You've got to answer these.
Yeah, mate.
First thing, I just wanted to go through before we jump into that. Can you just go through what a plyometric is for the listeners? Because that's going to be mainly the focus today.
Yeah, look, a pure plyometric is something that has a very quick contact time, requires a large stretch shortening response, so very elastic in nature, and typically can be quite aggressive. I think in the industry at the moment, people use the term plyometric for a number of jumping and landing variations. I typically refer to it as a true plyometric or something that is on a plyometric continuum, meaning a landing position or anything like that to me is on the continuum of plyometrics. But in the technical term, it's not a plyometric. So if I had to say it, a true plyometric is aggressive, high stretch shortening cycle usage and low contact time.
Beautiful. And that leads into the first question. So this is yes, no, maybe, and we'll delve into each of them potentially as we go forward. Does a plyometric need to have a contact time of less than 0.25 seconds to be classed as a plyometric?
Wow, there's no official classification, so no.
Great answer. Are plyometrics typically underdosed in strength and conditioning programs?
Yes, I think as a group, yeah, they are. But as individuals, I think people that get caught up in plyometric training can sometimes overdose it. So as an industry, underdosed. As individuals that don't understand plyometric training, potentially overdosed.
Great answer. Are plyos often underutilized in an athlete's development?
Yes.
Are plyometrics and jumping exercises poorly programmed in a lot of HIIT classes?
Yes.
And you would obviously see a lot of this at Athletes Authority, people coming in after being at F45 or whatever it is and having injured themselves via the very poorly programmed plyos that they do there and heaps of box jumps, all that sort of jazz.
Yeah, and look, I think that falls under that term of what a true plyometric is versus a plyometric continuum or jump land. I think there's a lot of jumps programmed, but a jump and or plyometric is not a conditioning solution in my mind.
Yep, agreed. Do you believe physios need to be better at referring to S&C coaches?
Honestly, no. I think most physios are pretty good at referring to S&C coaches. I actually think physios need to be better at taking more on that S&C coaches do, because there's a lot of stuff that physios, to be honest, act ignorant of it because they say, well, that's not my lane, when in actual fact, it kind of is. So I'd probably say the other way. I think most physios are reasonably understanding that it's good to create a network of strength conditioning coaches to refer to. I actually think we have more issues with physios not understanding good training habits and good programming structures, therefore using as a cop-out to say, oh, no, well, that's the S&C's role. I'll just do this. So I actually think that's more of an issue.
Yeah, for sure. Do universities need to increase the amount of strength and conditioning education in their physio courses? And that's a good segue from what you just said.
Yeah, 100% they do. I just, to be honest, I also feel for universities. Well, I don't because they make a hell of a lot of money. But I don't know where you're going to put it. When you lay out, you might say it's a 4-year course or even 5 years, depending on how you're going through it. But 5 years, break that down in semesters. You're rolling 10 semesters, break that down into weeks. It's maybe if you're lucky, you got 50 weeks. Then you keep rolling deeper and deeper. Okay, within that 50 weeks, how many hours do you like? Your time actually goes very quickly when you break it down. And I had this discussion about exercise physiologists as well, because I really believe that the exercise physiology masters should be, before you do the masters, you decide if you're going to go down a clinical physiology route or a sports physiology route, because you just don't, 18 months, you just can't fit both in. So you're either going to go into the hospital realm and that clinical side where you do sit to stand, you do a lot of treadmill tests and all these type of things, or you go down the sports route and you get amazingly good at return to runs, change of direction education, linear speed work, high end and end stage rehab work. You can't put both of them into an 18-month masters. You just don't have enough time.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that probably should be an elective. I think because physio, you need to encompass the neurological stuff, the cardiopulmonary stuff. There was most of that sort of thing I didn't want to do. I knew I just wanted to jump straight in musculoskeletal and sports. So in my opinion, I think there should be some form of elective that you can do if you want to go down the line of maybe more of the sports-based stuff where there are more S&C focused education blocks, and whether that be more practical stuff combined with more placement in the field. Like a good example would be going and doing, a couple of sessions at Athletes Authority, or even doing your sort of grad intern program or something like that. But look, it's so hard because all the universities, they make, as you said, they make a hell of a lot of money, and where do they fit it in? I think maybe that's the way to do it with potentially, who knows?
Yeah, and to be honest, on a lower level, that's what I say for exercise science students, because to be honest, in an exercise science degree, there's actually not as much coaching as you would imagine. So my first recommendation for any person going into exercise science is become a personal trainer and get your experience as a personal trainer, because unfortunately, you're not actually going to get that much coaching experience through an exercise science degree. And when you step out, that's the one thing you're going to need. So being a PT and jumping in as a personal trainer and actually getting used to coaching people, doesn't matter if they're elite athletes or they're, the Fran, the accountant that lives down the road. It's still interacting with people and understanding how exercises get put together, understanding how session times go. You look at, 90% of grads that write programs, they've got 45 minutes with someone and they've written a program that would probably take 4 hours. So they're the type of things I think you need to get good at doing outside of your university work. And from a physio standpoint, that's exploited. It's volunteering your time to go watch a clinic, work with clinicians, see how they do it, get the practical side. You just can't get that at university.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, mate. Last question. Would you get a client that's 15 to 20 kilos overweight to perform plyos? I know that's a tricky one.
No, I wouldn't. No.
How about if they wanted to start running and they had a goal at the end of the year, say for instance, in December this year, they want to do a fun run of 5 kilometers. Would you just get them to do any plyos in the coming months?
Yep. And that comes back to the old continuum. As I said, you certainly could do landing work, tall to shorts, and get them accustomed. But you got to understand, running is a plyometric style exercise. So 100% of running's on one leg. So straight away, you've now got unilateral plyos that you're doing. So would I be getting them to do 3 hop for distance? Definitely not. But would I be doing tall to short thing, maybe altitude landings, teaching them to absorb body weight? 100% all. Yeah.
Okay, great. Love it.
But now, to be honest, number one, I'd get them to lose weight. Everyone gets 100%. Caught up on the mechanical side. I would get them boxing. I'd get them on a bike. For any way to get calories out. I'm still a bit old school with that. So if someone's overweight, get them fitter.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I often use the numbers on how many times your body weight goes through certain muscle groups when you are running. And people just are shocked, it's 6 to 8 times your body weight through your soleus and 4 to 6 through your quad and 2 to 3 through your glute with some of the studies. So when you tell them that, they are like, oh my God, I didn't realize that running's that difficult. And people think that they can just go run, and no matter how heavy they are or how unfit they are, they can just go running. But it's very, very difficult, and you need to progress slowly to get to the point where you can run. So yeah, 100% agree, mate. Now, you've referred to the continuum a few times, and you've absolutely nailed it with that continuum that you've posted up on your Instagram before. And you also, I'm pretty sure you did the plyometric continuum at the ASCA conference a couple of years ago. You went through it, I'm pretty sure. Let's just go through the continuum.
Sorry, if that drill's getting to you. They're having a way. I don't know if you can still hear me here.
I can hear you. It's a little bit muffled, but it should be right. Yeah, it's all good.
That's okay. Hopefully they stopped.
Did you hear what I said in regards to the plyometric continuum? Let's just go through the continuum that you have put up on your Instagram in terms of the phases, and also how you normally structure a client's progression through that.
Yeah, so basically the continuum as a nature is exactly what we sort of hinted to before, that when you're prescribing plyometric training, it's going to be very hard to give true plyometrics to everyone and understanding the flow on how to prepare someone for true plyometrics. So back in the day, they used to talk about you've got to squat 2 times body weight. And that references exactly what you were talking about around ensuring that, you can withstand the amount of body weight, whether that's 1 times, 2 times, 5 times, 7 times through the musculoskeletal system. So they used to have these precursors. Well, there's no point doing plyometrics until you can squat 2 times body weight. For me, that's a fair indicator of your ability to perform true plyometric work. There's no point doing true plyometric work if you're not strong enough. But realistically, everyone should be able to do some sort of absorption work. Is that still coming through? I can try and move if you want, if that's just getting a nightmare.
No, it's okay. I think we'll be absolutely fine. And when you're talking about the eccentric absorption phase, which is obviously the first phase, what type of exercises are you talking there? Because a lot of physios listen to this, and new grads and even students, so they're probably not accustomed to talking about this type of eccentric absorption plyometric work.
Yep. Yeah. So it's probably a better way, the 5 phases that you typically start with. So eccentric absorption is our first phase. Second phase is in concentric development. We then have our jump integration, where we start to integrate both of them. We roll into then continuous jumps, and then we finish with the shock method, also typically known as your true plyometrics and the more aggressive stage. So the eccentric absorption comes down to the old phrase of, learn how to slow down before you speed up. So when we're doing eccentric absorption phases, that is tall to short landings, getting used to absorbing eccentric loads, whether that be very light, just body weight, or in an altitude standpoint where you'll actually step off a box, land, try and absorb some added body weight. From that, as people start to adapt, we move from that into some single leg work, again, trying to eccentrically absorb on a single leg standpoint. We can then start to add a little bit of weight, whether that be through trap bar, through kettlebells, dumbbells, whatever you want to use. From that advancement, they then push into the concentric development, where we start to teach them how to produce force. So the assumption is of absorb force now. Now we want to produce force. So things like box jumps, where they're jumping, they're using that concentric development, but they're actually not really absorbing much, which they've already started to learn separately. So the idea behind that is to try and teach people to absorb and then to produce, but at separate times, so they don't have to put the two together. The jump integration style is when we start to add in your typical jumps, where it might be a counter movement jump, might be a squat jump, where they're now learning how to actually produce force and then learning how to absorb force. From that, we then roll into our more continuous side of things, where it might be hurdle hops, hurdle jumps, sort of mini hurdles to high hurdles, and trying to actually produce force continuously and absorb, start to use that stretch shortening cycle. And then we'll start to produce into our end range work, which is obviously into the shock method style of things, which is our very, very short contact times, very large forces, and huge production of force movements, whether that be continuous or just in a single nature.
Great answer, mate. Love it. Now, in regards to how often you should be performing these, and you actually did this on your Instagram recently, you said the eccentric absorption phases, we're looking at roughly 3 to 4 times a week, and we're looking at roughly about that 50 to 70 contacts per session. Let's just go through the contacts per session and what that actually means. How would you describe it, and how would you program it if you were looking for that many times per week and also that many contacts per session?
Yeah, look, the reason that I put that up is a lot of people ask, what do I prescribe? Reps, sets, everything like that. And it is a very hard one to quantify. Whether you like it or not, plyometric training, whether that be low-level jumps all the way up to high-end work, it is a subjective load in a lot of cases. People do react and respond very differently. As you alluded to, people with different heights, different body weights, everything like that also respond differently. And then also people with different jumping experiences. Sprinters respond differently to say, someone who's a court-based athlete, than a court-based athlete through to a swimmer or something like that. So people do respond very differently with it. So the guidelines that I put up there are very general. They are open to interpretation based on your context and based on your experience. But the idea behind contacts and using that as a bit of a range and a guide is trying to give yourself at least a starting load and a starting volume that's objective that you can actually then go up and down from. Now, when someone doesn't respond well to plyometric training, it is quite obvious in the fact they will pull up sore quite quickly and they don't recover that well from it. You start to get pain a lot more around the shank, obviously shin issues, you can get tib-ant, tib-post things, tendons start to flare up, whether that be patella or quad tendons. So there are some pretty obvious signs when someone's not tolerating jumping loads, in which case, obviously, you want to reduce the volumes. But the idea behind a contact point is a really good starting point from what I've seen anecdotally from when I worked with junior athletes, especially at the Giants, when we had these young boys coming through, large running loads, trying to tinker with what their perfect volume and perfect loading was, all the way through to the more elite athletes that I've worked with, even your explosive Ferraris in whether it's rugby league, some of your wingers and stuff like that, and to see what they can tolerate. And then also what we see here at Athletes Authority, we've got the joy here of we've got as young as 6-year-olds that have wanted to come on board, and obviously they don't do as structured jump training, but all the way through to our elite. We've got a couple of Olympians with W League players and things like that we also get to see. So this range allows us to create a reasonably good idea of what sort of loading occurs. And like you just alluded to then, each phase you can absorb a little bit differently. So the earlier phases, simply because of the nature of them, they are a lot lower in load. You'll notice that the capacities are a lot higher, meaning we do a lot more volume of that, simply because the intensity is so low. A tall to short, you can absorb a hell of a lot of exposures per week. And the reason we can do that is because the recovery time is so quick. So if we have a young athlete, they might do tall to shorts Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So they're only having those 2 days in between each of them, quite easy to recover. As we start to progress through that continuum, obviously the neural load is much higher, the tendon load is much higher, just physical musculoskeletal load is quite higher, and coordinative load is quite high as well. So as that starts to creep up more and more, then we start to notice our volume comes down in each session, but also our gaps between sessions also become a lot more. So as we're towards the end of the continuum with our more advanced athletes, they might have 1 to 2 really good sessions of plyometric training. And when I say sessions, anywhere between 2 to 3 exercises at the beginning of their program in what we term our velocity block. And that might be for 2 sets, 3 sets, again, depending on the exercise, versus our younger ones, which they're doing a lot less intensity because they're further down that, earlier on in that continuum, but their exposures can be much higher. So they can be nailing those type of things 3 times a week.
Yeah, well put, mate. Very well put. Now, in regards to when you're performing these plyometrics, you've already alluded to it already. You're saying that you're doing it more in that, or the start of the session, or the velocity block. So are you typically programming them at the start, and how many exercises typically are you going to give to an athlete?
Yeah, look, I've done plyometric work at every single location in a session. Before field sessions, because that's all I had time for. Before weight sessions, middle of weight sessions, end of weight sessions, even at the Giants, professional setting. We didn't have access to our turf because the coaches wanted to do a skills rotation in the first half of my weight session. So I simply didn't have any space to jump. So we would do our weight session. Halfway through our weight session, our turf area would be free. Coaches get off. I moved all the players on and we did plyometric work then. So first and foremost, it's when can you be consistent and when can you fit it in? Obviously, based on that context will indicate what you can actually do. Sometimes you just simply can't do really high-end plyometric work if the time or the opportunity you have to do it is not conducive to a fresh athlete that can actually sustain the load. The same token goes for if you're doing it at the beginning of a field session. It is very hard to do exhaustive plyometric work where you might have quite aggressive free hop for distance or things like that. Doing that before they then do a 2-hour session that may involve high velocity running as well, probably not the smartest thing to do as far as statistical likelihood of injury. So I've done everything. For us here, and the nicest time I like to do it is at the beginning of their strength session. So they'll do their prep, they'll get themselves nice and warm, and then they'll flow into their velocity block. That is for probably about 80% of our athletes. So they will typically do anywhere 2 to 3 exercises for 2 to 3 sets of a given contact range. My number one time to do it is as a contrast or a complex method. So I like to use a heavy lift into a plyometric, but typically that'll be, as I said, for probably 20% of our athletes that are going to be the more advanced athletes, or they're in season and things like that, where they may do a heavy box squat and then they'll go and do a broad jump, or they might do a 3 hop for distance with that. So the utilization of contrast or complex methods for me are where I always try and get people, and where I will naturally program most of my plyometric training. But even if I do have that in a program, their velocity block will still have some low amplitude plyometric options, pogos, lateral bounding, these type of things that aren't that aggressive, but are really important to keep, joint stiffness, might be shank health, whatever it might be.
Let's go back to that. So the post-activation potentiation that you effectively alluded to just before, what is it first? And also, why do you use it? Because a lot of physios and new grads out there would probably be like, what the hell's this?
Yeah, look, people that have done their PhD in PAP or post-activation potentiation will probably gag at my very simplistic version of it. But there is a lot to it. So don't make my analysis of dumbing it down, make it simpler than what it really is. But effectively, overloading, or we're using a heavy lift, so it might be a 1RM, 2RM, anything like that. The idea is we have a larger muscle recruitment. So we have bigger muscles, and those muscles require far larger recruitment of fibers. So the idea is, once we've neurologically stimulated all those fibers, we can then go over and use them in a jump. If I jump cold, my body will do only what it has to do. Let's make this up, could be 70% of a VMO fibers will start to function in a jump. Then I go and squat heavy, come back, 95% of those fibers are now fired up, ready to go. So that's the very simplistic version of what PAP is. It's using a heavy lift to prime, or at least activate, neurally engage, integrate, whatever word you want to use, to then use it in a jump. Now, most of the research uses around a 5-minute rest. If you've ever done any type of strength training with any human, 5 minutes rest is just never going to happen. So I'm a big fan of dirty science. I love reading research and then looking at how we can actually make it useful and practical, because a lot of it isn't. It gives us a good grounding in what we can look at and what we do. But ultimately, when you work with groups, when you work with human beings, you can't always apply everything perfectly. So I certainly do not follow a 5-minute rule. If I followed a 5-minute rule, especially say the Giants or Parramatta, we would get through 3 exercises and then we're out the door. And to be honest, I really don't see much of a degrade in results. We've done a number of internal studies around just doing simple vertical jump testing after heavy lifting, after light lifting, beginning a session, end of session. And at the end of the day, lifting heavy and then going to go and then try to jump, they always produce great results. So I will always do it as a contrast or complex method, meaning I will do a heavy lift, and then they will literally walk straight over, get themselves ready, and then they go for it. The rest time will be, they'll use a mobility drill typically between those two, anywhere between 1 to 2 minutes, and then they go again. Again, depending on how heavy the lift is, they might creep up to about 3 or 4 minute rest between each set. But the actual time between the heavy lift and the contrasted plyometric training is usually maximum 30 seconds.
Agreed. And I use it a lot too. Like, I get a lot of clients that only want to train for 25, 30 minutes, and it's a great way to sneak it in. And it's very time efficient. So I completely agree there. Now, the other day I had a client come in and they'd done some box jumps to a box that was way too high. They missed. Mm-hmm. They grind their shin along the edge of the box, and they'd taken a big chunk out of their shin like that long. Now, explain to the listeners why you jump onto a box versus no box.
Yep. One, I would recommend never jumping onto a hard box. I hate hard boxes. One, wooden boxes are jerk boxes. They're for Olympic lifting and stepping up. I do not jump onto them. 2, if you have any of the metal boxes, it just freaks me out every time. They have the sharpest corners in history. And I've never seen them sit in the gym without someone injuring themselves. So yes. I beg people to get soft boxes for jumping, for that exact reason. You can have some of the best jumpers and they just move their arms incorrectly and they swipe their finger on the edge and they cut themselves. So please try and get soft boxes if you can. But the reason we jump on a box is exactly the phase that we talked about in that concentric development. So the idea behind landing on a box is to reduce landing load. Simple as that. It is not a height target. it can certainly be used as a height target, and there's sometimes where people like to visually get a feel of where they're jumping to. But I'd argue you're much better to use a hurdle for those type of things.
Agreed.
So when you're jumping onto a box, the idea behind it is you want to drop in a counter movement position to take off. The angles that you achieve in that counter movement position, which is typically 45 degrees at the knee, maybe 80 degrees at the hip, everyone's a little bit different. You want to replicate that when you land. So when you land on the box, you should look very similar to the takeoff position that you had in your jump. It does not matter if your athlete or your client is jumping higher than the box. They're still reducing their landing load, and that's the key. Another part of that is I can't stand people that use a box jump. They land on the box, and then they step off the box and just land like an altitude landing, in which case they've just completely ruined the whole reason for having a box. So where possible, endeavor people to either step off the box if they can, but if they're getting so high, put another box next to them so they can actually step off the box, because the reason you use it is to reduce landing forces. And the reason you do it is either because they're early in their plyometric development, or they already have a lot of loads. Might be a track and field athlete in season, might be a football player in season where you're just trying to continue with some concentric development, but you don't want them to have that residual fatigue of landing.
Beautifully put. Now, in regards to hurdle jumps and hurdle hops, a lot of people would go to the gym and not have access to hurdles. What's your take on not using a hurdle and just pretending the hurdle's there? Or are there other alternatives that you can do and use at the gym?
Yeah, look, it's you can be as creative as you like. You know, I've seen people hop over kettlebells and things like that. I would suggest where there is a high risk of injury with a low return, probably not worth it. I have even seen people set up barbells in racks and jump over the bars into the rack, which is, again, it's just a recipe for disaster. So if you can't have vertical targets, then I would always suggest phase one, you'd have horizontal targets. So if you don't have a hurdle to jump over, I still think, jumping versus jumping over a hurdle, there's still value in jumping, but if you've ever jumped over a hurdle, it does hold you accountable like no other. And most people will say they consistently jump high when using hurdles or that contrast style method. But realistically, if I don't have it, I would say just do horizontal work. So broad jumps, hops, hop for distance. That's still going to produce a hell of a lot of force into the ground. Depending on what you want to get out of it, most track and field coaches would say they'd prefer horizontal forces anyway for a lot of running and movement mechanics from that fashion. If you're a court-based athlete like a volleyballer or a basketballer, obviously you want some vertical stuff, in which case I'd probably suggest picking a place on the wall that you can actually do a counter movement jump and try and touch and things like that. I do value targets, and I think hurdles and things to reach for are really valuable. They're not the be-all and end-all, but I think you should make sure that you've got something in your program where you're held accountable. If that becomes horizontal, becomes horizontal.
Yeah, and a really nice tool that I often use is just get someone to take a little tape measure, even just one of those small retractable tape measures in to the gym to keep them accountable so that they know that they're still pushing themselves to jump 100%. As far as possible. So I really like that, either a broad jump or a triple broad jump or some hops forward, that sort of stuff. So at least, especially in season, like I find a lot of athletes in season, they kind of just put the handbrake on and they kind of cruise a bit. At least if you get them to take the tape measure in, they get competitive. You want to use an athlete's competitiveness to your advantage. So I think that's very beneficial. Now, Lachie, you posted something quite interesting yesterday. It was funny that you posted it yesterday when we're doing this. So the low amplitude jumps on those weird boxes and stuff that you were working with yesterday. Park. Yeah, it literally looked like a skate park. I was like, I need my tech deck. So what are they, these new sort of positions and these, for the listeners, jump on Lachie's Instagram. It's hard to explain, but literally it looks like a mini half pipe. And then you've got sort of a V and an inverted V and all these type of things. And then the athlete was doing small, low amplitude jumps with double leg and single leg. Just go through what they're used for and why you use them also.
Yeah, look, they're certainly not new. They're very old in nature. I first saw them. So effectively, they're called Polish boxes or amplitude boxes, depending on who you speak to. I saw it in 2010 roughly through a couple of track and field coaches. They've been used for all sorts of track and field sports, also across French jumpers, Polish jumpers, and stuff like that. They're certainly not heavily used. And to be honest, I even said in the post that apart from one article by Carl Bale on them a couple of years ago, I actually haven't seen anything else online, and very rarely they ever mentioned in books. So there's something that from a low amplitude jump, meaning a low amplitude jump typically is going to be ankle shank related. Once that knee starts to get involved, you get to a more moderate amplitude. As the hip gets involved, you're now talking sort of higher amplitude. You have to be a very, very advanced athlete to do a moderate to high amplitude jump, just utilizing your shank. There are a lot of people that can do, yes, triple hoppers and stuff like that, and they're very good at it. So what the box does is basically allows us to create a slightly different environment to progress and to lateralize our low amplitude jumping. So when we do low amplitude, anyone that thinks of a low amplitude jump, they think of pogos, single leg pogos, and then they start to run out of exercises. So what tends to happen is they use these low amplitude options early, but as they start to get boring or the athletes start to adapt to them, instead of progressing the exercise, they actually kind of move away from the exercise. So the beautiful thing about the amplitude boxes are they create slightly different stimuli across different angles that you can now keep progressing and keep lateralizing if you need to. So as we know, the way our foot ankle works is certainly not in a nice linear plane, especially on a football field, even on a court. I think everyone's seen photos of tennis players reaching and their ankles are just at always crazy 90-degree angles. So the idea behind the amplitude boxes is we do low amplitude work. So just small jumps, small hops, not really getting much more than 5 to 10 centimeters off the box. They're higher volume, higher repetition, but because of the angle of the boxes, it allows that foot and shank to change angle quite a lot in the way it moves. And the idea behind it is it's trying to teach us to create some good stiffness from awkward angles. So when we change direction, we can create some really good ankle shank stiffness to press off and change direction. When we're jumping, we're landing in awkward positions. We start to manipulate the foot, manipulate the ankle to allow it to work Achilles, soleus, gastroc, plantar fascia, everything that contributes to our ability to create that joint stiffness, but also produce force. The idea is we try and trick it and expose it to as many angles as possible. And again, the idea of putting it up there is I really love them and I've really enjoyed using them, but they're just not available to buy anywhere. So I had a good friend of mine who's a builder. He built them for me, which is fantastic. So I've been able to use them and we've had a heap of interest in them. So well, let's see if we want to start looking at building them and getting them out to people. And the more we can start to get people to really appreciate the complexity of low amplitude jumping, it becomes a really unique way to keep plyometric load in without a lot of residual fatigue. There's a lot of talk, especially Mike Young talks about it, Derek Hansen talks about it with micro dosing speed into athletes, meaning we do little bits as often as we can. I really believe plyometric training is a very similar concept. That the more we can use this micro dosing concept, meaning we don't need to have huge blocks of high-end work. Boxers have been doing it for years with skipping, and there's people around that still believe in skipping is a very, very important part of their return to run programs and their rehab programs. This is the same concept, but it allows us to be a little bit more creative with the angles, and also a little bit creative with our progressions, because to be honest, when you work with athletes long periods of time, at the end of the day, you've got to keep them interested in what they're doing. There's still going to be your core exercises and core as in key exercises that you're always going to value and will always be involved in the program. But at the end of the day, you've got to keep athletes, on their toes, forgive the pun. They've got to be ready to go. They've got to enjoy what's coming next. They've got to look forward to the next program or the next iteration of things. It's the old style of change without change. You should still be nailing the basics all the time, But if you're not being creative to keep your athletes engaged, then I think you're going to lose them pretty quickly. And you probably miss the art of what coaching is.
For sure. And if an athlete or anyone wanted to do this type of low amp stuff with those Polish boxes, but didn't have the space or the money to get them, have you got any alternatives up your sleeve, either in the gym or at home?
Realistically, it's really up to imagination, because if you, as you can see, like a pogo itself does not, you can do an in-place pogo, simple as anything.
Yep.
You can take an in-place pogo to an in-place hop. Or pogo hop, nice and simple. You can then add in a line or a cone that you're hopping and over, changing direction on. You can add a foam pad you can be hopping on and off. There's a whole heap of different unique things you can add in, but most people don't really think about doing it. And you're spot on. Like, don't get me wrong, I love the boxes and I use them. I think they're really novel and stuff like that. But Jesus, there's plenty of athletes that have never used them and are still elite.
Yes.
You don't need them. They're just a really great way to instill some good variations. And I also am a big believer in athletes add value, or at least hold value in things that they can see as a little bit more complex. And what I mean by that is, if you have a Nordic curl, and this is one of my biggest gripes, that Nordic curls will often be put at the end of a program. The athlete needs someone else to hold them. They just fall over. It might be two sets of six. So they don't value it. They don't value the progression, because there is none. Like, it's just trying to get better at the same exercise. Versus you use a glute ham developer and you do Nordics, you do glute ham raises, you do different razor options, different Bosch holds. Suddenly there's a physical instrument for them to use. There's suddenly progressions they can see. They can see themselves get better, therefore they graduate to another exercise. So when you can add value like that, changes their whole outlook. When you have a pogo, it is harder. It's like, oh, now we're just going to put a cone down, and you go over and oh, okay, great. Yeah, it might entertain for a little bit. But when you're like, okay, you get to jump on, the D box that goes up and high, and that's unique. They get to have a go. And yeah, you don't need it, but it allows my job and my coaching ability to be far greater, because they get better buy-in with things like that.
And that's one of the beauties of plyometrics, you can get a bit creative with it and make it kind of fun, especially if you've got an adolescent or an adolescent athlete or a child. You can make it fun, and you can use different implements to make it fun. And even just the addition of a hurdle for a kid or an adolescent athlete makes it so much more fun. Like, jump over that hurdle and they're like, they get competitive and they just love it. It's a hell of a lot more fun.
100%.
Now, you mentioned, lateral plyometrics before, and when would you start to integrate more of your lateral and rotational plyos in terms of the continuum that you do use?
Yeah, so for each phase, they all have different starting points. We've got our vertical stream, which does have a lot of our first, what we call phase 1 and 2, which is the eccentric absorption phase, that first phase. There's two sort of phases within that. And there's a lot of tall to shorts, these type of things. When we go across, we have our horizontal and our rotational and lateral work. These are the ones that start a little bit lower down, because as you can imagine, like, there's not really much from an eccentric absorption that you do from a lateral standpoint, because you're getting all your decel work you need to in a vertical plane. So they start a lot lower down, as in phases 3 and 4, which is our concentric development, and they'll usually start around our wall drills. So for our horizontal one, we do some wall leaning work, so just our simple load and lift. With our lateral work, we do exactly the same thing, but a little bit more of a lateral hitch position, and then they start to progress into simple lateral bounding, low amplitude, obviously not coming off the ground very far. We're going left to right, right to left, nice and simple absorption. And our horizontal ones are very simple bounding, sort of hop and sticks. So they're bound to a stick, where they're really controlling that eccentric portion. They don't need to contribute much. They're more focusing on just nailing that concentric development part. So you can roll all four, if you go horizontal, vertical, lateral, and rotational, all tend to, we're doing a piece of the pie sort of all the time. But the vertical stream is the one that we'll tend to start the earliest with, because we can do so many variations of our eccentric absorption rather than the other streams. But that's not to say we don't use some advanced ones in the simpler streams. For example, we talked about the pat position, where we might do a heavy lift into a plyometric option. I do sometimes see people doing, say, a heavy box squat and then going and doing this little sort of rotational bound. And it's like, well, you're kind of missing the point of what you're doing there, because anything rotational automatically increases that motor patterning, that motor control requirement. And anytime you increase that, you actually draw away from maximum force output. So if I'm doing contrasted or complex methods, I'm always going to use a more simpler option to be able to execute maximum force output. So I might be working with an advanced athlete that in their velocity block, they might have a couple of really good rotational movements and things like that to get them from a movement standpoint. But when I'm box squatting them and I'm going into it, they might just do a broad jump. So it may be really quite early on the continuum, so to speak. But because it's quite simple, they can execute and put in more force into the ground there than they would in a rotational, more complex lift. So it's really important to understand that just because something is more complex, it doesn't mean it produces more force or is better for improving jump capability. When you look at, say, for example, track and field athletes, I would probably argue that they actually don't really need to go through a lot of the rotational plyometrics and these type of things, because if they're rotating, they're fucked up somewhere else. You know, like they're just running in a straight line, whatever it might be. So for them, they're much better to do really aggressive free hop for distance. And that's where you do see a lot of track and field athletes look at strength conditioning coaches sometimes and go, what are you doing? Like, you're just overcomplicating everything. Like, just keep it simple. And they're right. A lot of times you do. You just got to keep it simple. But I also come from the other fashion of, if I'm rehabbing an ACL, then you know what? I'm throwing the kitchen sink at it. Like, I want this person to be able to have so many different movement capabilities and be so fluent in so many different angles that I do want them to be doing rotational work, being bumped in the air, landing in different positions and stuff like that, to make sure not only physically they're confident, but mentally they are confident as well, because they've been there, they've done that. But I can certainly see how there's a number of track and field coaches out there that look at a rotational plyo with getting bumped in the air with a Swiss ball. We're like, boys, you're making this way too complicated than what it is. So there's definitely the two sides of it. But I like to sit in the middle because I think there are value on both. And I think a lot of people get annoyed when your answer is, well, it could be both.
Yeah, there's a grey area for sure. And it's very client dependent as well, goal dependent, sport dependent. So, and you just got to throw a lot of different exercise and plyometric options into your toolbox and to pull out when you need them for sure. So I think everyone out there that's listening, I think jump online, check out Lachie's plyometric continuum. I think it's great. And how could people learn more about all this stuff in terms of with you guys at Athletes Authority, etc.?
Yeah, look, we had a big philosophy here that we wanted to nail inside the four walls first, and then go outside the four walls. And we've you know, you're never perfect; you're always evolving and changing. But I think we're at a stage now we're really happy with our product and our service that we offer our athletes and our rehab crew. So we've actually just opened up our coach immersion program, which, to be honest, we've actually just sold out 4 of them. So there won't be another one till next year, but it's a 3-day all immersive program for physios, coaches, EPs, whichever your area comes from, where you physically come in and get taken through all of our systems, from rehab to strength conditioning to all of the plyometric work, everything we do, get to watch on the gym floor how it gets implemented, but also get educated in lectures and seminars on why we do it and how we do it, which is quite a unique experience, we think, especially in Australia, where you can not only come and learn everything we do, you then physically see it implemented as well. So that's sort of our number one at the moment, but also we are looking to release hopefully the end of this year. Whenever I say that, it probably ends up being next year, but we are looking at doing a sports rehab certification, which is sort of trying to fill the gap a little bit, where whether you're an EP, physio, strength conditioning coach, I think all three, you know, one of my good mates, Selwyn, who's at Melbourne at the moment, he's an osteo, who is arguably one of the best rehabbers in Australia when it comes to mid to end stage work. So for me, you know, it doesn't matter what your background is. If you've got the skill set, you can take end stage rehab. And I think it's an area that's kind of hotly debated at the moment. Should physios be taking it? Should EPs be taking it? Should SNCs? And to be honest, I think everyone can. But I think all courses lack a lot of the information required to produce a very strong systemized approach to rehab with good exit criteria good return to run protocols. So that's what we're going to make. And we're sort of in the process of doing that with Justin as well, who I know you've spoken to on the previous podcast. So yeah, trying to amalgamate a lot of our information and bring that together and get a bit of a course running where people can upskill in it.
Sounds great, mate. And where do people book for next year's intake?
On our website. So if they jump onto athletesauthority.com.au, that is where all the information is. But ultimately, our Instagram or my Instagram is a really good place. Anytime something gets announced, we put it up, we put the links up. So it's a really good way to keep abreast of everything that's happening.
What's your Instagram, mate, just for the listeners?
My Instagram is performancecoach_Wilmot. And then Athletes Authority is literally one word, Athletes Authority.
Beautiful, mate. Any last words?
Mate, no, I think one, really appreciate you asking me on, and two, I think it's fantastic to see S&Cs and physios chatting, because I think it's this imaginary war that people have got that no one knows who started and no one really knows why or what's happened. But I think a great S&C should know about 50% of what physios know, and a great physio should know about 50% of what S&Cs know. And if you're going to sit there and be stubborn and ignorant to say, oh, that's not my role, I think you've really missed the idea of what our profession is, especially if you're working with athletes. They live their life in the grey area. They're always just about to get injured or have just been injured. So I think it's something that all the best S&C coaches understand and know rehab, and all the best physios understand and know how performance affects lifting and athletic development. So I think the more we can start to integrate, the better. I think people just need to pull their head in and stop getting so annoyed with each other.
Amen to that, mate. And it's all about the client getting the best result possible, and you got to leave the ego out of it. 100%. I completely agree.
Agreed.
Thanks for your time. It's been absolute blast. I think a lot of people learn a heap out of this, and I guarantee a lot of people will reach out either to me or you going forward, physios, EPs, etc., that want to learn more.
Happy to.
Would love to jump into that immersion program going forward. And mate, it sounds great. And I just love the fact that you guys are doing what you've done. And personally, I've been into Athletes Authority for an injury, and seeing Alan there and how you've integrated everything is exactly what should happen in the strength and conditioning physio world. I think it's absolutely phenomenal. So congratulations. It looks great.
Great. Thank you very much, mate. Appreciate it. And hopefully you can hear everything over the construction here, but I promise you it'll be worth it in the end.
No, it's all good. All good, mate. We got through it. This podcast is live on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. And as usual, stay strong.